So I think we're all back. We all are recording. So let me kind of move through what I found of importance in the reading. This reading was selected from a text called the Selected Writings and Speeches of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is probably one of the foremost political strategists in the Pan-African context, one of the most successful organizers and mobilizers within the United States. His organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, was the largest mass political movement of African people in the United States. This speech, or this declaration that we read, it was given or presented at the International Convention of the Negroes of the World in August 31st of 1920, excuse me. But keep this in mind, Negroes of the world, right? So he's not thinking about just Negroes in the Americas, just Africans on the African continent, but he's thinking about African people globally. I, for the sake of this conversation, will supplement the term African for Negro. And when I do so, I do it with an Pan-African perspective, something that's all-encompassing of all African people, regardless of where they reside. As I mentioned, his organization was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. But in what we read, there's 12 complaints and 40 declarations of rights. So I wanted you guys to pick up on that. He says he's complaining about the lack of voice as it pertains to the creation of laws and legislations. He's complaining about taxation without representation, and then still being forced to serve in the military and things of that nature. He's against all such inhumane and unchristian, uncivilized treatment of African people. This is an ethical critique of the Christian nation. This to me reminds me of Douglas. He's concerned with the global plights of African people, right? So again, as I mentioned, it's not just Africans in the Caribbean or Africans within the Americas or Africans on the African continent. He's talking about a global vision of African people. And then he wants African peoples to be recognized as a community among themselves, right? So again, regardless of where you stand, regardless of where you live, you are part of this African community. And this ties directly to the notion of Pan-Africanism. And he also makes the claim that African people are free citizens of the world and free citizens of Africa. Now, this is very forward thinking because I believe in the 1950s, this notion of a global citizen kind of comes to bear. And you see Garvey talking about this as early as the 1920s. He's also calling for an even-handed justice, right? So the type of justice that Derek Chauvin is receiving, he feels that all African people should receive the same justice, right? And he says, when we do not receive that type of justice, all African people should be feel disrespected. This idea of Africa for the Africans, critiquing the fact that Europe was able to come into Africa, carve Africa up, and extract all their resources. He says that it needs to be rectified, and Africa and African resources should be for African people, just as Asia should be for the Asiatic, Europe should be for the European. He also protests against negative stereotypical depictions of African people through the media, through the newspaper, through writings and things of that nature. And then he also claims that to teach the inferiority of African people is an insult to all African people, right? So he says we shouldn't go into institutions of schooling and have to learn about ourselves being inferior. That's an insult, okay? And to me, this is probably one of the more important things. The unjust restriction of the African imagination, right? So the restriction on the idea or the ability just to imagine. And why this is fundamentally important for me is because if you can't imagine, you can't shape and see the future, right? And if you can't shape and see the future, you're stuck in your current state. And this is very important for me to see that Garvey picked up on that. The ability to travel unmolested, right? That's something that we're still dealing with today. And then he also says the colors red, black, and green. Red, black, and green being the colors for all African peoples, right? And he is the one who came up with the Pan-African flag, which is the red, black, and green flag. Red being for the blood, black being for the people, green bean for the land. Okay, so that's a real brief depiction of my notes. Also, I want you guys to be attentive to what Douglas is doing and what Garvey's doing with the same content, right? And that's why I posed the breakout room questions that I posed. So, okay, I kind of went ahead of schedule. Cool. So with the time left, let's jump into our breakout group, our fishbowl, and then we'll have a group conversation about the text. Is there anybody who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I could go, Professor.
Okay, so we got Juan.
Me too.
Yuki. Okay, thank you guys. One more. Anybody else want to volunteer? Okay. So Brandon, are you willing to fishbowl?
I'm gonna have to skip this week. Okay. I can go next week though.
Okay, sure. We'll ask you again next week, or you can volunteer, whichever you prefer. Let's see who else. Serena, are you willing to fishbowl today?
I'll do it next week if possible.
Okay. Let's see who else we got. Yaretsi, are you willing to fishbowl today? Yaretsi, are you willing to fishbowl today?
Can I skip?
Yep, absolutely. Okay. And then Fatima, are you willing to fishbowl today?
I already did my 2 fishbowls.
Okay. Thank you for reminding me. Crystal, are you willing to fishbowl today?
Can I do it next week?
Armini, are you willing to fishbowl today?
Can I skip today?
Jasmine, are you willing to fishbowl today?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll have Juan, Yuki, and Jasmine for a fishbowl, then we'll open up to group conversation. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I'll go first.
Okay.
What I got from the reading was that I felt like, I know they were titled as "We Complain," but I feel like it wasn't a complaint. It was more like oh, this isn't right to, have this be treated this way. And then his rights were like, they're reasonable, because at that time Africans were still treated, as slaves, and still treated as, they were like they're not people, basically, because with segregation and with everything that was going on, it was still unfair to be like, oh, this, just because of the color of his skin or where he comes from, we can't share anything together. Like, it's not fair. So for the first question, the way Douglas used the Constitution and he used it, I would say that Douglas, he believed in the Constitution. However, he just wanted to be reformed. He wanted the rights. He wanted the same rights as the white people were getting, as everyone else, because that's what the Constitution should stand for, not just for the people, because they helped them fought as well, and they were still there when they were still trying to break away from England. So I felt like he was like, oh, I believe in this, but we need to help each other out, basically.
Yeah.
But I would say this person was like, I believe in it too, but we need this first and we need that, because this is not right. And you said that we should have our rights already, but you're not giving it to us just yet, because you guys just say, but you guys are not doing. That's what he's saying. I feel like that's what he's saying. And then the counter storytelling, I would say that he believes. I feel like he's making a point where everyone should get the rights, and I strongly believe that around the whole world, everyone should have equal rights to do this and that. And yes, every country has their own rules and their own beliefs, but once you go to their country, you should be treated as a visitor, not as a, like that person who's like, oh, what's he doing here? What's he doing over here? But they have that mindset of like, oh, I don't want this person here, I don't want this person there. But you should always welcome, visitors, and always welcome, because we're all human beings, and we all should live in harmony. That's why. That's what I got from the reading, and that's my answer to the two questions.
Thank you, Juan. Good job. Who's next?
I'll go next.
Okay.
What I get from the reading was like this article was like written in 1920, like which is like 100 years ago, which is like more recent than the Douglas one, and still it's didn't prove much. Why he like complains a lot in the first, and also his like the declaration is like he is telling the why like the parts where like Black people weren't fair. He's addressing like the unfair places in the terms of education and including free speech and like respects to people. And I also got looking forward about the African people are not having Africa as a home since in 1920, European colonized almost every land from Africa. And yeah.
Cool.
When he's that in conclusion, like he's addressing the declaration is not helping proceed in the way it's written.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kliki. That's a very good job, man. Jasmine, you ready?
Yes. So from what I understood from this reading, it was very different from the Frederick Douglass reading. I believe that this one was more of like what, from what I understand, a word that I can get out of this story is equity instead of equality, because I feel like equality is for everyone, right? It's being equal to everyone. But I see that he wants equity, meaning like what they need is what they get. And although, okay, the white people already have that, they should have what they have. So I hear the word equity in this story rather than in Frederick Douglass. Francisco from my group brought up a good point, how Frederick, he shared a link, how Frederick Douglass seems more like if he believes if white people are with them or against them. And unlike on the story that for this week, I was able to understand that they want more, like I said, equity. That's what I can really, really tell from the story. And it's a huge difference for the same reason that he puts out what he wants or what all people want, rather than Frederick Douglass just going based on what white people are saying of them or like what he's thinking, what they are, where they're trying to stand on. And yeah, that's what I mainly got or mainly understood from the story.
Yes. Jasmine, you bring up a real good point, and I think the way you encapsulate the story is spot on, right? It's equity, right? Yeah. And the difference between equality and equity, right? So equality is saying that everyone could get into Dodger Stadium, right?
Yes. Yes.
But equity is saying that everyone could get into Dodger Stadium and have, first base seats or behind the home base seats, right? That's an equitable distinction between equity and equality, right? And so what Garvey is saying is like, yeah, you have your constitution, right? And your constitution is serving a particular segment of the population, right? But this constitution is going to strive for equity within a global context of people who are globally not being recognized as human, people are globally who are not being treated as human, people globally who are not being afforded rights and representation and being taxed without this representation, right? So I think that's a really good way to contextualize the understanding of the article. So I think that's a great way of phrasing it, because it's true. And then also with the notion of Africa for the Africans, right? It's not just the coming off of the land, right? And saying that you could live here, but it's also going with the notion of the resources of that land, right? So what would it mean if all of the diamonds that are produced in Africa, the wealth of those diamonds are being matriculated back into African people, right? What would it mean that, so for example, Ghana will no longer make chocolate for the Swiss. Have anybody heard about like Swiss chocolates and how it's supposed to be like this really delicious type of chocolate? Has anybody heard of that at all?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the thing about that is that Swiss chocolate, it comes from Ghana, right? So it's not even produced in Switzerland, right? So what would it mean if the whole legend of Swiss chocolate is now is applied to Ghana? And people, instead of people saying, oh, let me go buy this Swiss chocolate that is imported from Ghana, you actually give that money back to Ghana, right? What would it mean if the cobalt that's in everybody's computers and phones is not going to Apple and Samsung, but is going to the people of the Congo, where that cobalt is being derived from, right? So this is this notion of equity as it pertains to the homeland of Africa, right? And this is when he says, you know, Africa for the Africans, this is what he's saying. Right now, there's a really big conversation about reappropriating African artifacts from European museums back into African museums, right? It's another element of Garvey's Africa for the Africans, right? So our cultural productions should also be housed in our own museums because we produce them, right? So this is a way to settle the contradiction that says Africa is the richest land with the poorest people. What does that mean? Africa is the richest land with the poorest people.
I think like Africa has a lot of like resources, including like minerals and stuff. And also they have like a lot of population from now.
Right. So what Yuki's talking about is the material wealth of the African continent, right? I have a homeboy from Zimbabwe, and he talks about his great grandmother used to say when she was a kid and she would go play, she would literally kick up diamonds, right? Just out playing. That's how much diamonds were in the soil where they grew up, right? And they didn't have the monetary value of diamonds. They were just stones that were everywhere, right? And it wasn't until the Europeans came in and said, well, this is a diamond, this is how much this is worth. And they started forcing them to mine those diamonds, right? So you're absolutely right, Yuki, and highlighting and being attentive to the fact of the mineral resources of the African continent. But what about the other side? Yeah, go ahead, Kevin, please do.
Yeah, to Yuki's point and to the question you brought up, to me, honestly, like Africa, in saying that Africa is the richest land with the poorest people, for one point, I kind of see it is that like Africans have been so oppressed throughout like basically like the whole time they've been here, and you know everybody kind of looks down on them, especially because of everything that's happened to them. But people kind of like overlook the fact that from where they come from, like Africa, like, oh, they think it's just whatever, but they have a lot of resources to offer. Kind of reminds me of like Wakanda from the Marvel.
Yep. So that's a good comparison. And then two, right, implicitly within that statement is the reality that the wealthy nations of the world, Europe, United States, right, the only reason that they have their wealth is extracting African material resources, right? And one of the largest material resources that's extracted from Africa were the people, right? So this is, you guys really unpack this notion of Africa being the richest continent with the poorest people, that you tackled that spot on. What else jumped out at you guys from the reading? What do you think about the his attentiveness to the stereotypes that are produced by what he calls alien races for African people? He says, teaching. So why do you feel it's important for him to call out the use of stereotypes in the inaccurate depictions of African people? So what does the work of stereotypes do? So think about Baldwin, and we talked about the pillars of white supremacy, right? And one of those pillars being the white imagination. And I said one of the greatest symbols of the white imagination are the movies that are produced in Hollywood, right? And I talked about how these movies that are produced produce a particular depiction of African people that derive these stereotypes and tropes, whether it be hypersexualized, whether it be hyper violent, right? So what do you guys think about him being attentive to the role that stereotypes plays in shaping the way that people are viewed?
Honestly, I think from the role that he puts in as stereotypes, I think it kind of like people are really quick to stereotype Africans into what they were in the past. Although, like if you look deep into it, they were actually like really smart people, and some of like some of like one of the early prime civilizations that there was to exist. And so I feel like people overlook the fact that in the past and still in the future, they're still great and smart people. But since their past has been really scrutinized by slavery and oppression, they tend to overlook that and stereotype them into what they used to be.
Yeah. Yep. And really, these stereotypes allow for the justification of Africa being the richest continent with the poorest people, right? Because the stereotypes will say that these people aren't deserving of the riches that are naturally theirs, right? They don't have the wherewithal and the foresight to manage these riches in a way that will produce them wealth and capital, right? When in fact, that's not the case. They just don't have a relation to things of the earth in a way that it has to be monetized, right? So it's not necessarily a example of their uncivility, but it's more a reflection of how they relate to the earth, right? I also found one of the declarations, Declaration 11 on page 19, he says, we depreciate the use of the term nigger as applied to Negroes, and we demand that the word Negro be written with a capital N. And so for me, this is interesting, especially from an academic standpoint, right? Because you may not have noticed this, but every time I write black, right, I write black with a capital B. And as I would continue through my academic journey, I would always get the mark that would say that this should be lowercase, right? And for me, I was always informed by Garvey in this idea that, you know, it should be capital, right? Because we are people, we are things, right? And to knock off the capital is to kind of, in a sense, take out the humanity of the people who are being classified as Black. The same does not ring true when you write African, right? So typically, if you're going to write African, you're going to write that with talking about African people, that will get the uppercase, and that'll be grammatically correct. But Garvey's picking up on this, and he's again forward thinking in the sense that Negroes not getting that capital, right? And we should deserve that as people, right? And it's a temporal thing because at the time that's how they were being referred to, right? But it carries over as we begin to, in the 1960s and the early 1970s, take on this notion of Blackness as an identity and say, you know, Blackness is something that we're proud of. You still get this struggle as to, did you capitalize or not capitalize this description as Black, right? So, and I found that interesting, his foresight at least 40 years prior to the Black Power movement. What he's up to in this is kind of foreshadowing some of the struggles that I was going through as an academic, trying to classify Black with a capital B, right? Let's get one more comment and we'll call it a day, and I'll let you guys know what we're reading for next week. Someone we haven't heard from. Actually, if you want, Francisco, you could just mention what you
I'm just saying that it makes sense the way that you put it, like uppercasing the letter B on a community. It's like saying, it's just giving them the respect that they deserve.
Yeah.
So I can understand what you're talking about with that aspect. That's just my thought. I didn't really have too much an understanding.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's about respect and it's about humanity, right? It's like just recognizing the humanity in people and recognizing these individuals as human subjects, right?
Right.
Let me jump to our Google Classroom real quick and I'll show you what our next reading is, and then I'll email those out to the class on Thursday or Friday. Give me one moment. Okay. For our next reading, okay, yeah. So we're going into more contemporary thinkers. We're gonna jump into some speeches. So the next one that we'll deal with is Malcolm X, the ballot or the bullet. You'll notice that you have both the PDF version and the video from YouTube, or the audio, excuse me. Try to engage both of them, because a part of our conversation will be about the distinctions between hearing it, audio version, and the distinctions between reading it, okay? So try to engage both of them so that way you can be able to make those distinctions. Again, I'll email you out the PDF and the link to the YouTube copy. And then we're gonna try to get into more contemporary conversations. Also, this reading and this speech is what I pulled from the video that we watched last week that I did for my project. So we'll be engaging the speech that was sampled in that project itself. So are there any other questions that you guys have for me before we call it a day?
Yes, I want to ask a question about the group project. So how are we going to be doing it?
So good question, Cecilia. It's totally up to you on how you present the information, right? You guys could put together a podcast. You could put together a PowerPoint presentation. You could put together like a video project like I demonstrated last week. You could put together like a radio show. How you do it, I'm allowing you to be as creative as possible. The only request that I ask of you, it doesn't go beyond 10 minutes. And at some capacity, you're engaging in a counter storytelling narrative of the Constitution. And that's why I had you guys read what we read this week, because that's exactly what Garvey does. He presents a counter storytelling Constitution. Does that answer your question, Cecilia?
Yes,
okay.
I think so.
So
Thank you.
I'm being a little bit vague because I want you guys to be creative, right? Like as you get further on your academic journey, right, you'll notice that your professors get less hands-on in how they want you to cultivate things, because they want you to really pull from your creativity and pull from your mind and your thoughts. So I'm trying to kind of give you guys that freedom to be as creative as possible. So if you draw, use your drawing and find ways to incorporate that into your project. If you sing, find a way to incorporate that into your project. Whatever you do outside of class that you find interest in that's artistic, I would love for you to incorporate that.
Okay, and also the content that we present has to be like totally related to the discussion that we had in the class, or the readings that we had in the class.
Yes.
Or can we do some other research to get more information?
You can more than welcome to use other information, other resources outside of what we covered in class. But think about the information and the material that we covered in class as a framework to help you think about this counter narrative that you're telling about the Constitution, right? Think about all of the ill treatment that a certain segment of the population is receiving, and how would you address that ill treatment, right? That's kind of what I want you to think about as far as the material.
Thank you.
Any other questions, you guys? Another thing about the project, I'm sorry, in your presentation, let us know what amendment or article that you had and how you'll be problematizing that article. So it should be like, yo, our group is Amendment 1, and this is what it says, but this is how we're representing that amendment. So that's the only other criteria that I would have for other projects.
One more question, I'm sorry. What is the presentation date for this project?
Good question. So the last day that we meet in class, that's not our final. So the last week that we will meet as a class will be our presentation. What the goal is to get through these presentations that day. And then if we do that, we don't have to meet for the final. If we're not able to get through these presentations that day, then those groups that don't go would come for the day that's assigned for our final, and we'll knock those out there. So it would be the last week of class, and then if need be, the day that's assigned for our final.
Is the last day of our class on May the 11th?
I believe.
I just want to.
I believe so. I could check the schedule and
okay.
let you guys know next week. I just don't have that at the top of my head right now.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, you guys. Be safe, be well, have a good week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good week.
You too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You will. You guys have questions, Daniel and Armini?
Professor, I have a question. For this week's reading, is it journal 9, or how many journal entries are we supposed to have?
I'm not sure. I would have to look. I want to say it would be 9, because I believe you submitted 8 journals for your midterm point, correct?
Yeah, someone was saying it's 7. One of them is extra credit or something, but I'm not too sure, but I did submit 8.
Yeah, so you should be fine. If you submitted 8, then this would be journal number 9.
Okay, also, on the Google Classroom, there was 2 places to turn in the journal entries. Is it okay if I did it on the one?
It's cool. Like, they both go to the same section for me.
Okay.
So, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Daniel, you too. I mean, thank you. Daniel, did you have a question?
Yeah, like I was thinking about it right now. When we present, do you want us to send you like a copy of whatever we present?
If you want, you can. Typically what I do is I just grade it in the moment. So like while you guys are presenting, I just kind of take my notes down, and that for me will determine the grade. But if you want to send that to me, that's perfectly okay too. Okay,
yeah, because I know a lot of, like, I know for senior design, we're submitting video recordings of the proposal, because a lot of people have like internet issues and stuff like that. So I wasn't sure if you wanted something similar, if we were supposed to like pre-record or something like that.
We haven't had, and typically the technical issues have been on my end more than the class, to be honest with you. But it also depends on like what format that you guys are using, right? So like, just say, for example, if you do a podcast, that will probably be something that's pre-recorded and then we just come and watch, you know what I mean? So yeah, it just depends on what format that you guys use. But for me, I'm good either way. If you feel that you need to, then cool. But if not, I could just take my notes and media res in the moment and give you guys your grades that way also.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, Danny, have a good one, man.